December 1944. A refugee shelter in Verviers, Belgium. The winter wind howls through shattered window frames as 30 young orphans huddle together on a bare stone floor, shivering under a single threadbare sheet. Outside, the temperature plummets to 10 degrees below zero. A heavy American supply truck grinds to a halt in the snow, its driver staring at the children through the frost-rimed glass. 6 wool blankets change hands in the dark, passed from the back of an army truck to a grateful nun. No paperwork is signed, no permission is granted, and no authorizations are filled out. It is a simple act of human warmth in a frozen wasteland. Yet within 1 week, this single act of mercy is officially classified as a federal crime. General George S. Patton will soon discover the charge sheet, and his response will permanently alter the rules of mercy on the European front line. This is the story of what happened when an American army inspector attempted to court-martial a sergeant for saving freezing children, only to face the swift and devastating wrath of a general who despised bureaucratic cruelty. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe. We tell the World War II stories that show when mercy was the only crime that mattered. Sergeant Thomas O'Brien was 28 years old, a rugged supply, non-commissioned officer from the tough waterfront docks of South Boston, Massachusetts. Before the draft caught him, he spent his youth shifting freight on the Atlantic piers, leaving parochial school at 16 when a falling crate killed his father and left a family to feed. Enlisting in 1942, he had spent 3 long years overseas, watching the slow, grinding destruction of civilian life across 3 separate nations. He had seen the hollow eyes of hungry children in the dust of Sicily, the ruined villages of Normandy, and now the frozen, shivering populations of Belgium. The sight of displacement had broken something inside his hardened exterior, leaving him entirely unable to drive past suffering without offering whatever aid his truck could carry. On that bitter December afternoon, his inventory at the Verviers depot held exactly 200 heavy olive-drab wool blankets, meaning the 6 items he handed over to the convent orphanage represented a mere fraction of 1% of his total stock. To O'Brien, the math of survival was simple, and he stood by his choice when the heavy iron lock of the supply depot became the center of a criminal investigation. Captain Reginald Hayes was 34 years old, a meticulous legal investigator serving in the Judge Advocate General's Corps, originally hailing from a wealthy estate in Hartford, Connecticut. A proud graduate of the Yale Law School class of 1934, Hayes viewed the entire European theater not as a theater of human tragedy, but as a vast ledger book that required absolute, unyielding balance. In 14 months of continental service, he had initiated 89 separate disciplinary actions, every single one directed at an enlisted soldier, while completely ignoring the minor infractions of the officer corps. He possessed a deep, almost religious devotion to the sanctity of military property, routinely stating to his staff that personal compassion was a civilian luxury that caused nothing but chaos in military logistics. He walked the freezing mud of the supply depots in custom-tailored wool trousers and immaculately polished leather boots, a stark contrast to the grease-stained fatigues of the men he audited. His efficiency had earned him 2 rapid promotions, but to the frontline troops who watched him count rations, he was nothing more than a vulture hunting for careers to destroy. By December of 1944, the European theater had dissolved into a brutal, freezing crisis. The German army had launched a massive, unexpected counteroffensive through the dense forests of the Ardennes, forcing Allied forces into a desperate scramble to hold the line. Supply lines across Belgium and France were severely strained, stretched to the absolute limit by sub-zero temperatures, heavy snows, and the sudden displacement of thousands of civilians fleeing the combat zones. Entire towns lay in ruins, leaving local populations without food, coal, or basic shelter in the middle of the coldest winter Northern Europe had seen in decades. In the chaos of this massive retreat and counterattack, military governance often became decentralized, forcing low-ranking soldiers to make immediate, life-or-death choices regarding the desperate locals begging at their gates. Many American officers looked the other way when a handful of rations or fuel logs went missing, understanding that the preservation of human life was far more critical than a flawless line in a supply log. Senior commanders recognized that strict bureaucratic adherence in a frozen combat zone was not only impractical, but deeply damaging to local relations. Yet, The rear-echelon legal departments remained entirely insulated from the freezing reality of the front, maintaining a rigid focus on paperwork while men froze in the fields. The clash between rigid administrative rules and the horrifying realities of the Winter War grew more intense with every passing day. In the middle of this logistical nightmare, the strict paperwork of the rear clashed directly with the basic survival of the front, setting the stage for a confrontation that would escalate all the way to the top of the Third Army Command. Captain Hayes walked into the wooden administrative office of the Verviers supply depot, with a clipboard tucked firmly under his arm. He tapped a finger against a line on his ledger sheet and looked directly at the company commander. "I am missing 6 heavy wool blankets from the Eastern Sector inventory allotment," Hayes said. Captain James Walsh, a 32-year-old commander from Buffalo, New York, looked up from his desk with bloodshot eyes. "We are fighting a war in a blizzard, Captain. People are freezing every single hour. The regulations regarding federal military property do not change with the weather," Hayes answered, his voice completely flat. Sergeant O'Brien stepped forward into the room, removing his wool cap to reveal his cropped hair. "I took them, sir. I handed them over to Sister Marie Claire at the convent down the road because 30 orphans were sleeping on bare stone in 10 below weather." "You removed government property without proper requisition forms or a signed receipt from an authorized Allied liaison," Hayes said, writing a note on his pad. "They are little children, Captain, and they would have frozen to death before your liaison finished his breakfast." O'Brien said, "That is entirely irrelevant to the accounting system of the United States Army," Hayes replied, looking over his spectacles at the sergeant. "This is a clear case of misappropriation of government property for personal disposition to civilians, totaling a loss of $42. I am not forwarding these ridiculous charges to headquarters." "Captain," Walsh said, slamming his palm down onto the wooden desk, "this man saved lives, and I am putting a permanent stop to this paperwork right now. You do not have the authority to suppress a formal investigation into the theft of military stock," Hayes said, pulling a pre-written charge sheet from his leather case. "If you refuse to sign the endorsement, I will bypass your office entirely and forward this directly to the Third Army Legal Review Board. Do whatever you feel you have to do, lawyer, but get out of my command post before I have my guards throw you out into the snow," Walsh said. Hayes packed his papers into his briefcase with deliberate, slow movements. "Discipline requires that even the smallest infractions be prosecuted to deter larger thefts across the entire European theater," he said. The legal inspector left the room without another word, carrying the signed court-martial recommendation straight to the courier jeep outside. The report reached Patton within the hour. Patton arrived within the hour, his open-top jeep skidding to a halt outside the headquarters building in a flurry of white snow. The general walked in unannounced, his 4 silver stars gleaming against his wool coat and his twin ivory-handled revolvers resting in their holsters. Every officer and clerk in the room snapped to absolute attention. The sudden silence, heavy and absolute. Patton stepped directly over to the desk where Captain Hayes sat waiting, his face completely devoid of expression as he looked down at the legal inspector. "Captain Hayes, you have charged Sergeant Thomas O'Brien with the theft of 6 wool blankets, value $42, for distributing them to 30 orphans freezing in a Belgian convent during the coldest week of this war," Patton said, his voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the room. "Is that correct?" "Sir, the property regulations are clear, and the integrity of the logistics system must be maintained at all levels," Hayes answered, straightening his shoulders. "I asked you to confirm the facts, Captain," Patton said, his voice dropping a register. 6 blankets, 30 orphans, a Belgian convent below 0 weather, yes or no?" "Yes, sir," Hayes said. Patton reached out, picked up a match from a small container on the desk, and struck it against the wall. He picked up the criminal charge sheet, holding the bottom corner directly over the flame until the paper caught. He watched the fire spread across the typewritten lines before dropping the burning page into a heavy brass ashtray on the desk. The sharp smell of burning paper quickly filled the small wooden office. "Captain Hayes, the charges against Sergeant O'Brien are dismissed by my personal order," Patton said. "Furthermore, you are removed from inspection duty effective immediately. You will be reassigned to a frontline rifle company where you will spend the next 3 months experiencing the exact conditions that produce sergeants like O'Brien. You will learn what 10 degrees below zero feels like to a person without a blanket. You will learn what compassion looks like from the inside. General, the regulations do not permit arbitrary reassignment without. Hayes began. Captain, I am modifying the regulations effective today. Patton interrupted, turning his back on the lawyer, sharing of personal issue supplies and rations with civilian non-combatants, in circumstances where their immediate welfare requires it, is authorized at the discretion of the issuing soldier. Such transfers will be noted in unit logs as humanitarian distribution and will not be classified as theft or misappropriation. The amount transferred shall not exceed 5% of any soldier's personal allocation in any month. Reports of such distributions will be made monthly to Division G4. This order is effective for all of 3rd Army. Adjutant, get it on the wires. Captain Hayes, pack your gear. Your transfer order will be ready in 30 minutes. Hayes stood frozen for a moment, then turned and left the office in complete silence. The transfer order was signed and delivered before the ink on the General's new humanitarian directive could dry. Captain Hayes was stripped of his polished leather gear, issued a standard infantry pack, and marched out into the freezing Belgian snowbank under the watchful eyes of the base guards. By dusk, the former legal inspector was sitting in a shallow frozen foxhole on the outer perimeter of the Ardennes line, listening to the distant rumble of German artillery. The bitter wind whipped through his standard-issue wool uniform as he shivered in the dark, watching the frost form on his rifle barrel with no shelter from the sub-zero temperature. Back at the supply depot, the enlisted clerks watched the news of the reassignment spread across the teletype machines with quiet, stunned satisfaction. Word of the confrontation traveled like wildfire through the freezing ranks of the 3rd Army, passing from frozen foxhole to frozen foxhole within 24 hours. Soldiers who had spent weeks hoarding scraps of canvas or extra rations to help weeping mothers along the roads suddenly breathed a collective sigh of relief. The heavy atmosphere of bureaucratic fear evaporated, replaced by the realization that their commander valued human survival far more than a perfectly balanced ledger. Sergeant Thomas O'Brien returned to his supply depot the following week, finding 6 brand-new, heavy wool blankets resting on his intake counter, delivered personally by a 3rd Army courier. He went home to South Boston after the war, married his childhood sweetheart, and operated a small neighborhood hardware store on the waterfront until his peaceful death in 1989. He never spoke publicly about the legal charges that had nearly destroyed his military career. But he kept a small, wrinkled piece of paper inside his wallet for the rest of his life. It was a letter from Sister Marie Claire, thanking the quiet American soldier who had brought warmth to her freezing orphans in the darkest hour of the winter. At his explicit request, his family placed that single, faded letter inside his casket before he was buried. Captain Reginald Hayes survived his 3 months on the winter line, returning to Connecticut after his discharge in 1946 to practice corporate tax law in absolute obscurity. He spent the remainder of his life in bitter silence, occasionally complaining to close associates about the breakdown of official military discipline during the European campaign before his death in 1974. General Patton never recorded the incident in his personal diary, nor did he mention the legal dispute in any of his public press conferences during the final push into Germany. However, a single carbon copy of the revised humanitarian supply regulation remained tucked inside the bottom drawer of his personal desk until the day he died. Written across the margin of that document in his own sharp, aggressive handwriting was a brief, unmistakable note stating that an army which broke its own rules to save children was the only kind of army worth commanding. Some historians have argued that Patton's sudden disruption of the established military supply chain set a dangerous precedent that undermined the absolute authority of the Judge Advocate General's Corps during a critical campaign. They contend that allowing individual enlisted soldiers to distribute government property at their own discretion invited widespread logistical chaos and theft across the European theater. Others have argued the opposite, insisting that the general's decisive intervention was a brilliant stroke of leadership that preserved the moral integrity of the American army while cutting through destructive rear-echelon bureaucracy. What is certain is that the humanitarian directive remained active for the rest of the war. protecting countless soldiers from prosecution and ensuring that thousands of blankets and rations reached the most vulnerable civilian victims of the conflict. If you had been in Patton's position, would you have done the same? Or would you have upheld the strict military regulations to maintain absolute logistical order? Let us know in the comments. And if you want more stories about when mercy was the only crime that mattered, make sure to subscribe.